A heat wave had settled over West Texas the evening Deputy Elias Ward ended his shift, the kind of dry, breathless heat that made the horizon waver like a living thing. The sheriff's office door creaked behind him as he stepped out, rubbing the bridge of his nose as though trying to push off the exhaustion of the last 12 hours. It was June of 1956, the start of a long, angry summer. Flies bit harder, tempers burned quicker, and every small-town quarrel seemed one spark away from turning into something worse. But Elias had always been steady, even on the longest days. He crossed the dusty lot toward his horse, a chestnut gelding named Bramble, brushing a hand along the animal's neck. Bramble tossed his head gently, almost empathetic to his rider's fatigue. Elias murmured something under his breath. No one ever heard what he said, and swung into the saddle with the easy grace of a man who'd been riding since before he could tie his own boots. He turned toward the east, toward the long stretch of land that separated the town from his ranch, a ride that usually took him an hour and a half if he didn't push too hard. People who saw him leave that night remembered nothing unusual. The gas attendant finishing his closing sweep recalled Elias nodding politely as he rode past. A pair of teenagers sitting on the bed of a pickup said he looked tired, maybe even more than tired, drained in a way they hadn't seen before, but they didn't think much of it at the time. He had a reputation for overworking himself. A rancher living near the ridge swore Elias even tipped his hat in that soft, courteous way he always did. Everything seemed normal. Nothing gave the impression that these would be the final confirmed moments of his life. The desert trail toward the Ward Ranch was a lonely one, stretching over rolling sandstone, brittle sagebrush, and wide-open silence. Those who rode it often spoke of how sound disappeared there, how even the wind slipped low and quiet as though avoiding something it didn't want to disturb. Elias had ridden it hundreds of times without trouble. He knew every bend, every scrub bush, every distant line of rock. He knew where Bramble liked to slow down and where coyotes typically crossed at dusk. But that night, something along the route changed, something no one saw. Sometime between leaving town and approaching the old Gulch, Elias vanished. No struggle heard, no gunshot reported, no witness claiming to have seen anyone else out there. It was as if the land swallowed him whole. At 10:30 that night, an hour after he should have arrived home, his wife Margaret stepped out onto their porch. She wasn't worried at first. Delays happened. Deputies were often called back for last-minute reports. She lit a lantern and placed it near the corral gate, a small ritual the two of them shared, her way of welcoming him home, his way of knowing she'd waited up. She kept busy until midnight, folding laundry that didn't need folding, cleaning dishes that were already clean. The house felt too quiet without the sound of him hanging up his gear or rolling his shoulders to loosen the day's tension. By 1 a.m., she was pacing. She tried to remind herself he was careful, capable, and rarely rattled. But in the desert, mistakes didn't need much time to become deadly. It wasn't Margaret who found Bramble. It was a local rancher heading out early to check his cattle. He spotted the horse roaming just south of the gulch, reins dragging, saddle twisted slightly as if someone had dismounted in a hurry or been thrown. Bramble looked panicked, sides lathered with sweat, nostrils flared, ears flicking toward the gulch over and over. When the rancher approached, the horse didn't flee, but its trembling made the man step back. Animals didn't behave like that unless something had scared them badly. He led Bramble back to the main road and rode straight to the sheriff's office. By dawn, word had reached Margaret. She arrived pale, clutching Elias's spare jacket as if it could anchor her in place. The sheriff, a stern man named Carver, instructed everyone to remain level-headed. Horses could spook, he said. Riders could fall. Maybe Elias had been injured and sought shelter somewhere nearby. But even Carver couldn't mask the worry in his voice. Deputies didn't simply disappear on empty trails. Not ones as seasoned as Elias. The search began immediately. Men on horseback, lanterns swinging, dogs brought in from neighboring counties, volunteers scouring the open desert. They followed Bramble's tracks backward, tracing the horse's frantic path. The hoof prints were erratic, circles, sudden darts sideways, stretches of dead-straight galloping. Something had terrified the gelding, that much was clear. What was missing were Elias's own tracks. No boot prints. No drag marks. No scuffed earth that would show he'd fallen or been thrown. The only human impression found along that stretch belonged to a searcher who'd stepped off briefly to relieve himself. Near the ridge, the last confirmed sighting location, the soil was soft enough that even small movements left impressions. But the trail behind brambles seemed untouched, as if the horse had run alone, as if Elias had never made it that far. Neighbors came forward with their memories of that evening. A store clerk mentioned Elias had been quieter than usual earlier in the day, not quite distant but thoughtful in a way that stayed with her. A farmhand who crossed paths with him in town said the deputy had paused to look down the main road longer than seemed necessary, almost as though waiting for someone to appear. Elias's closest friend, Deputy J.T. Briggs, admitted the two had argued days earlier about a case that wasn't supposed to concern them, something Elias believed wasn't being handled right. He didn't share details, but Briggs said he noticed a change in him afterward. More alert, more guarded, as if he'd been weighing something in his mind. Then there was the matter of Elias's home life, which many didn't fully understand. He and Margaret were well-liked in the community, seen as stable and hard-working. But behind closed doors, life hadn't been simple. Their attempts to start a family had led to heartbreak, something not talked about openly in that era. Elias had been carrying the strain quietly, doing his best to keep up with long shifts and extra responsibilities at the office. He confided in one friend that he felt stretched thin, tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Even with that context, no one believed he would give up, run off, or abandon Margaret. He wasn't that type of man. He made promises and kept them. Every piece of his life pointed toward home. As search teams expanded their efforts, the desert offered only silence. The ridge was scanned inch by inch. The gulch was examined from top to bottom. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder across flatlands, hoping for any sign of clothing, gear, tracks, anything. But the land felt untouched. Still, almost waiting. One deputy later recalled feeling something unsettling as he approached the gulch during those early search hours. Not fear exactly, but an awareness, like stepping into a room where an argument had just ended. The air felt charged, heavy. Even the dogs grew restless, pulling back from the shadows instead of charging forward. By the end of the first day, sleep-deprived and hollowed out by worry, Margaret stood at the desert's edge, staring at the trail her husband had ridden for years without trouble. In the distance, the sun disappeared behind a mesa, stretching the land into darker shades of red and black. She didn't cry. Not yet. Shock held her in place, a strange numbness preventing her mind from fully processing what the empty saddle meant. The men around her tried to offer reassurance, but their voices were thin. Every person who'd ever ridden those trails understood the truth. If Elias had fallen, they should have found him by now. If he'd wandered injured, the dogs would have sensed him. If he'd simply gotten lost, they would have heard him calling. But there was nothing. No voice. No trail. No sign of struggle or injury. Only a horse, too, scared to go back near the gulch, and a deputy who had vanished without leaving a single footprint behind. As dusk settled again, the search party lit lanterns and planned to continue through the night. But even with fresh determination, an unspoken fear crept into the group. It was the same thought that crossed every mind, whether they admitted it aloud or not. Something had happened to Elias on that trail. Something fast, something unexpected, something that left no trace. And whatever it was, it had taken him before he ever reached the gulch. By the time darkness swallowed the land, one truth had begun to solidify in the hearts of everyone searching for him. This was not an accident, and this was not a simple case of a man falling off his horse. Something else had happened out there in the silence of the West Texas desert. Something no one could explain yet. And before long, the search would reveal just how deeply that mystery reached. At first light, the desert looked harmless, washed pale by the sun, still cool enough that the air carried a faint sweetness from the sage. But the people gathering at the edge of the gulch felt none of that calm. They'd arrived before dawn, riding in from nearby ranches or pulling up in trucks coated with dust from the night drive. They expected a simple recovery. A deputy falls from his horse, maybe breaks an ankle, maybe wanders off disoriented. They'd find him within an hour. That was what they told themselves, because the alternative, that something else had happened out there, was too heavy to face this early in the morning. Sheriff Carver stood near Bramble, studying the gelding as if the horse might be able to explain the night. The animal was calmer than he'd been when found, but still reactive, snorting whenever someone stepped too close to the gulch. No one missed the way he kept glancing toward the ridge where the land dipped sharply. Horses didn't fixate unless prompted by instinct, and instinct rarely lied. When the search began, the volunteers fanned out in neat practice lines. Many of them had helped with searches before. Cattle gone missing, travelers stranded after a wrong turn, even the occasional runaway. This felt different from the start. Search dogs brought in from Pecos tugged sharply at their leashes, eager at first, but the moment they reached the narrow stretch leading toward the gulch, they stopped. Every handler reported the same behavior: ears flat, bodies low, noses to the ground, backing away. One dog began whining softly, refusing to advance even when coaxed. Dogs don't reason themselves out of work. They react to what's present. And something in that stretch of land told them not to go forward. The first hour yielded nothing. No body. No discarded gear. No obvious sign of an accident. Only Bramble's scattered hoofprints, weaving, doubling back, racing ahead again. Some showed deep indentations, as if he'd been pushed into a full panic. Others were shallow and uncertain, suggesting hesitations common when a horse senses danger. But there was still no sign of Elias walking beside him. By mid-morning, the heat had thickened. Sweat beaded on foreheads, hats dipped lower, and clothing clung to sunburned skin. But no one stopped. A deputy flagged down the sheriff, pointing to a set of prints at the south edge of the ridge. They were human, but wrong. The boot impressions were narrower and longer than Elias's standard-issue pair. They didn't match any searcher's prints either. Carver checked each one on site, making men stand and measure their soles against the fresh impressions. The stranger's tracks led toward the gulch, not away from it, and then abruptly vanished on hard ground. Men exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing aloud. Knowing someone else had been out there, the night Elias vanished shifted the atmosphere instantly. Elias had always been cautious. He didn't stop to chat with strangers while riding home after dark. He didn't have reason to meet anyone out in the middle of the desert, especially not near the gulch. Another deputy shouted for attention from 50 yards away. He held up a torn leather glove, the fingertips shredded, the palm scraped raw. Margaret identified it as Elias's left-hand riding glove, the one he always wore because the reins chafed a scar on his palm from an old rodeo accident. But the location where it was found made no sense. It was nearly 3 miles south of the ridge, far beyond the path Elias took home. If he dropped it accidentally, it wouldn't be that far. If he'd thrown it, there would be reason. No one could imagine a reason. The volunteers gathered around the glove in silence. It was the first confirmed item belonging to Elias, yet it raised more questions than answers. The glove looked damaged in a way that suggested violent contact with rock or sharp brush. But the surrounding area had no debris of that sort. It was flat land, mostly sand and scattered vegetation. Elias couldn't have fallen there if he'd never ridden there. Horses don't teleport. Riders don't teleport. But somehow his glove had. Rumors began whispering through the group before noon, growing like weeds in the absence of real facts. Some wondered if Elias had planned a meeting. Others quietly questioned whether he'd been investigating something privately, something he'd kept off the department's radar. A handful speculated whether he'd been taken, pointing to Bramble's frantic condition. And in the corners of conversations, where voices dropped to low mutters, a darker question took hold. Had Elias run? The sheriff tried to shut down those theories, but uncertainty spreads faster than truth in places desperate for answers. When a second team circled around to inspect the gulch more closely, they reached the point where the horse tracks simply stopped. Not faded, stopped. As if Bramble had halted abruptly, spun, and bolted in the opposite direction. The ground just beyond that point was undisturbed. No deep gouges from hooves slipping. No imprint from a body falling or rolling. No sign of Elias bracing himself on hands or knees. The land had been untouched that night, yet something had frightened the horse enough to turn him around violently. Searchers lowered themselves into the gulch, climbing down its slanted edges with ropes. They shouted up reports. Nothing. No clothing. No disturbed brush. No sign that anyone had gone down there recently. Even the soil looked wrong, smooth and loose in places where a fall would have carved grooves. It was as though no human being had entered the gulch for months. After hours of scouring the area, Sheriff Carver decided to regroup the teams for an organized grid search. Margaret arrived shortly after, escorted by her sister. She looked drained, her eyes swollen but dry, her expression locked in a kind of quiet disbelief that made people avert their gaze. She asked to see the horse. Bramble stood tethered to a tree, still restless but no longer shaking. Margaret placed a trembling hand on his neck, her voice quiet as she whispered her husband's name, almost as if expecting the animal to respond. Bramble shifted closer to her, lowering his head. It wasn't comfort, it was recognition. She told the sheriff that Elias never removed his gloves on the trail, unless something was wrong. She mentioned that he'd grown cautious the past week, stepping out onto the porch more often at night, staring into the darkness longer than usual. She believed something had been bothering him, something he hadn't wanted to burden her with. The sheriff asked if she believed Elias might have planned to meet someone. Margaret shook her head firmly. Elias didn't keep secrets that way. If anything, he protected her from other people's secrets. The sheriff listened, but he didn't share everything he knew. Earlier that morning, one deputy had mentioned a disagreement Elias had with a rancher 2 days before he vanished, something about cattle trespassing and a chain fence that had been mysteriously cut. Another deputy claimed Elias had been asking questions about a bootlegging route that supposedly ran through the southern canyons. None of it formed a clear picture, but it made the sheriff uneasy. By late afternoon, another puzzling clue surfaced. A volunteer spotted a faint line of tracks heading west from the ridge. Not horse tracks this time, but something lighter. Footprint, maybe. The impressions were shallow, walking at a careful pace, parallel to the main trail, but set at least 20 yards off from it. The direction made no sense. That part of the land led to nowhere but broken rock and open desert. The prints weren't Elias's, and they didn't match the earlier set of stranger tracks near the gulch. It was as if someone else had been watching from a distance. The sheriff paced the ground, staring at the conflicting clues. A torn glove miles off course. A set of boots no one recognized. Dogs refusing to pass a specific line of brush. A horse's panicked retreat. And now another set of prints that seemed deliberately placed where no normal traveler would walk. More strange than the clues themselves was the absence of Elias in any of it. If he'd been thrown, there would be signs. If he'd walked away injured, there would be tracks. If he'd been dragged, the sand would have shown it. But there was nothing of him, only the things surrounding him, displaced and scattered like pieces from two different puzzles dumped together. As the sun dipped low again, casting long shadows across the desert, something unspoken settled into the searchers' minds. They'd come out expecting to find a man who'd suffered an accident. Instead, they'd uncovered fragments of a situation no one could make sense of. The sheriff called off the search for the night, though no one wanted to leave. It felt wrong to walk away without answers. But the darkness came fast in the desert, and staying out too long only created more danger. Margaret lingered near the gulch long after others headed home. She watched the land as though waiting for it to give something back. Even when her sister urged her toward the truck, she resisted, her voice low, her jaw trembling. She said she could still feel him nearby. Not in a hopeful way, more in a heavy, haunting certainty that he hadn't simply walked away. The sheriff stood beside her for a moment, hat in hand, staring at the empty stretch where the horse tracks ended. He didn't know how to tell her what he was already thinking. The clues weren't pointing toward an accident. They weren't pointing toward a voluntary disappearance. They weren't even pointing toward a confrontation gone wrong. They were pointing towards something that had happened quickly, quietly, and without leaving the kind of trace human actions usually leave behind. As Margaret finally walked toward the truck, the wind picked up, carrying sand across the ridge. Within minutes, the strange boot prints began to fade. And as darkness wrapped the land again, the sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that the desert itself was erasing the answers, one grain of sand at a time. The next morning, a new discovery would pull the investigation in a direction no one expected, and make the mystery of Elias Ward's disappearance even more confusing. By the third day, the search had shifted from urgent hope to a quieter, heavier determination. The easy explanations had already crumbled. There was no sign of a fall, no trail of injury, no predictable path Elias might have taken if he'd been disoriented or hurt. The clues weren't lining up in any sensible way, and every hour that passed made the land feel larger, emptier, and more unwilling to cooperate. With nowhere else left to expand, authorities turned toward the one area they had hoped to avoid for as long as possible, Coyote Gulch. Coyote Gulch wasn't just a crack in the earth. It was a maze of jagged shelves, hidden pockets of shadow, and narrow corridors where sound could vanish instantly. People in town talked about the gulch with caution. Not superstition exactly, but with the respect men had for things capable of swallowing life quickly and without apology. Old ranchers warn about sudden wind tunnels that can knock a man sideways. The rocks shifted after storms. Dust slid underfoot with no warning. The gulch had a way of pulling the unwary in, and once someone went down, especially alone, they rarely found their way out. The search party entered the gulch at sunrise, the light still soft enough to trace shapes without blinding them. A few deputies moved along the upper edges, scanning from above. Others descended with ropes, dropping carefully into narrow seams carved by centuries of seasonal floods. Each man felt the temperature drop sharply the moment he entered the shadowed corridors. Even in summer, the gulch held on to the cold, making breath fog faintly in places where sunlight never reached. Within the first hour, they found something small but unmistakable. A section of brush in one of the upper passages looked crushed, as though someone had shoved through it in a hurry. The branches were bent inward instead of outward, hinting that a body had pushed from the trail side into the gulch's mouth. But the surrounding rocks told a different story. There were no scrape marks. No broken twigs littered the ground. It looked forced open, yet undisturbed at the same time, like something had moved through without leaving the usual aftermath. The sheriff crouched beside the brush, running a callous thumb along one snapped twig. Whatever had come through hadn't been a small animal. And if it had been a human, they'd done it in a way that made no logical sense. Men didn't vanish into crevices without signs of entry, not unless someone had guided them or forced them down a specific path. Deeper in the gulch, searchers came across loose gravel scattered at the edge of a narrow drop. The gravel pile was fresh, lighter in color than the stones around it, suggesting it had been disturbed recently. One deputy leaned over the edge with a rope tied to his waist and eased himself a few feet downward. That was when he saw it, a faint scuff mark on the vertical face of the rock, like a boot sole had scraped there, trying to find footing while sliding or being pulled. The mark continued downward for another foot, then disappeared completely, swallowed by a sheer drop that fell at least 20 feet before leveling out into a rock shelf. But there were no prints on the shelf. No impact marks. No sign of a landing. If Elias had fallen there, he would have left damage. If he'd climbed down intentionally, he would have left tracked dust or footprints. But the shelf was clean. The deputy called out that he saw nothing below, not even displaced dust. The sheriff felt a coldness settle into his chest, not fear, but frustration, the kind that builds when reality refuses to follow logical steps. Then another deputy shouted from 50 yards to the east. He had found something lodged between two broken pieces of rock. A pocket knife, worn, dusty, but still intact. Margaret later confirmed it belonged to Elias. It was a small detail, but an important one. Elias carried that knife every day, using it as a tool on horseback for cutting twine or scraping burrs out of Bramble's mane. The knife wasn't usually in a pocket. He kept it in a leather sheath on his belt. The sheath was never found. The knife's blade was closed. There was no blood. No dirt jammed inside the hinge. It looked like it had simply been placed there, gently caught between two stones like someone had set it down for safekeeping, or dropped it without force. But the location made no sense. The ledge where it was found was high up, on a path so narrow even experienced riders avoided it. Elias had no reason to climb that high. The horse certainly would not have gone near it. If Elias had dropped the knife during a struggle or while falling, it wouldn't have landed neatly between two rocks 6 feet above the scuff mark. As the search expanded, old threads of local memory began surfacing. A rancher in his 70s mentioned that a trapper had vanished in this same gulch back in the 1930s. A woman recalled hearing about a boy disappearing in the 1920s after wandering too close to the gulch's edge. Another man claimed a sheep herder had gone missing in 47, found only by his hat caught on a mesquite branch, with no body ever recovered. Authorities dismissed most of these accounts as exaggerated folklore or tragedies amplified by time. But privately, some of the younger deputies admitted they felt uneasy. Not because of spirits or superstitions, those ideas were easy to dismiss, but because the land felt wrong in a way they couldn't explain. The wind moved unpredictably, swirling through the passages in quick, hissing bursts. Voices echoed strangely. At times, they could hear sounds, shifting rocks, faint tapping, that stopped the moment someone turned toward them. It was during one of these quiet moments that Sheriff Carver ordered a survival expert to join the search. The man arrived late in the afternoon, studying the gulch with a practiced eye. He explained that places like this often disoriented people. Shadows played tricks. Wind tunneled in ways that could mimic footsteps or movement. A rider could lose balance if spooked. He laid out scenarios that seemed to fit. Elias might have dismounted to check something and lost footing near the edge. He might have attempted to take shelter from sudden gusts and misjudged a gap. Or he might have been ambushed in a way that forced him into the gulch. But as he explored the area where the brush had been forced open, where the knife was found, where the scuff mark trailed downward, he frowned. The theories didn't match the physical evidence. If Elias had slipped, there would be a drag path where his boots scraped over stone. If he had climbed, the dust pattern would show it. If he had been pushed, there would have been signs of impact or defensive marks. The expert found none. He suggested the possibility of Elias being led along the upper path, perhaps by someone he trusted, before encountering something unexpected. But the sheriff pushed him for details. How would someone move a full-grown man into a gulch without dragging him? How would they keep a horse from following its rider? How would the knife end up so high, untouched? The expert didn't have answers. He only admitted that the elements didn't add up. Something was missing between the scuff mark and the missing deputy. Even the air felt off. Ropes thrown down into crevices didn't fall straight. They angled inexplicably, brushing against rock faces as if nudged sideways by unseen currents. Dust drifted in directions opposite of the wind. And at least 2 deputies swore they heard footsteps behind them at different times, slow, deliberate, then stopping the moment they turned around. By sunset, the team emerged from the gulch with new evidence but fewer explanations. They gathered around their trucks, each man coated in dust, eyes squinting as the last light faded into dark orange. The mood was heavier than before. They had found no body, no hat, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle. Only objects that shouldn't be where they were, arranged as if someone had placed them with careful intention, or dropped them from above without touching the surfaces around them. Margaret arrived again as the men packed up, her voice thin as she asked whether anything new had been found. The sheriff hesitated. He didn't want to hand her objects with no answers attached. But she saw the pocket knife anyway when one deputy placed it gently into a bag. She recognized it instantly. Her breath caught. It was confirmation that Elias had been there, alive, with that knife on him. But it was no closer to explaining how he had vanished without leaving a trail. A silence settled over the group, the kind that made even the wind pause for a moment. Every theory they'd floated over the past 3 days had cracks in it. Every explanation contradicted simple facts. The land didn't behave like land. The clues didn't behave like clues. Nothing pointed cleanly to an accident, or an ambush or voluntary disappearance. It all pointed toward a moment that none of them understood, something that had happened so quickly and so quietly that the earth didn't have time to record it. And as the sheriff watched the sun disappear behind a jagged mouth of Coyote Gulch, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever had happened down there had only begun to reveal itself, and the next day would bring a discovery that would leave the entire search team even more confused than before. The first week after Elias disappeared felt like a long, feverish blur for the people of Ward County. What began as a frantic rescue effort gradually shifted into a waiting game filled with dread, frustration, and speculation. Volunteers still arrived at sunrise to search the desert, but their confidence had faded. The gulch yielded nothing new. The ridge gave no clues. The open flats around the trail revealed no signs that Elias had ever made it past the point where his horse spooked. Yet the sheriff's department continued to tell the public the same thing, that the most likely explanation was a tragic fall into one of the hidden crevices or drop-offs scattered through Coyote Gulch. They said it with firm voices, insisting that nature was unforgiving out here, and accidents didn't always leave clear evidence. But people who'd lived their entire lives on that land didn't accept that answer. They knew how the ground behaved after a fall. They knew how long a body would lie visible before coyotes disturbed it. They knew that someone as experienced as Elias didn't take risky shortcuts, didn't ride too close to edges, and never, under any circumstances, restrained his horse near steep terrain. And that last detail, the one the department hoped would quietly fade out of conversation, didn't fade at all. A deputy doing a routine examination of Bramble had noticed it first. Beneath the horse's mane, tangled deep against the roots of the hair, were small pieces of rope fiber, fibers that didn't match anything Elias carried on his saddle. It wasn't normal. A seasoned rider didn't tie their horse by the mane. They tied by the reins, the horn, or a post. That rope under the mane meant one of two things. Someone else had handled the horse, or the horse had fought against a restraint in a moment of panic. The sheriff didn't write it into any public reports. But word leaked anyway, and once it did, the public theory shifted. Quietly at first, then more openly, people began whispering that Elias hadn't fallen at all. He had been taken. The sheriff's department tried to smother the rumor, but the harder they tried, the bigger it grew. Even some deputies no longer believed the official explanation. They'd spent enough time in the Gulch to know the land, even with all its dangers, didn't erase people this completely. Something else had happened, something human. And that suspicion only grew stronger after interviews with two people Elias had trusted. A ranch hand who often shared late-night coffee with Elias at the gas station said that a few days before he vanished, Elias mentioned he felt someone trailing him during his patrol. Not every night, just on the quieter ones, when he rode the outskirts of town checking fence lines and livestock gates. He described the sense of being watched, of hearing movement that stopped whenever he stopped, of seeing shapes in the distance that disappeared when he tried to focus. He wasn't afraid, the ranch hand said, but annoyed, like someone was testing him. Another person, a young widow living near the southern canyon roads, told the sheriff that Elias had stopped by her property at dusk one evening. He'd asked if she'd seen unfamiliar riders or trucks passing through. She remembered his expression clearly, alert, tense, trying to stay casual. She told him she hadn't seen anything unusual, but that she'd heard distant voices one night near the canyon, voices she assumed belonged to hunters or travelers. Elias stayed longer than he normally would have. He seemed to be listening for something beyond her words, something only he could sense. When asked about it later, she said that it felt like he was carrying a secret he hadn't decided whether to share. As these interviews surfaced, older rumors started resurfacing too. The desert wasn't empty the way outsiders believed. There were moonshine runners who used old cattle paths to move crates across state lines. There were groups smuggling people through harsh terrain to avoid border checkpoints. And there were ranchers with reputations for settling disputes quietly and violently, leaving no paper trail for authorities to follow. Elias had never been one to stir trouble, but he had a habit of noticing things other men ignored. Even off duty, he kept an eye out for broken branches, unfamiliar boot prints, fresh tire marks in dry creek beds. Sheriff Carver had always appreciated his thoroughness, but as pressure mounted, even he began to wonder whether Elias might have seen something he wasn't supposed to see, something that changed the course of his night without him ever having the chance to call for help. Despite the growing suspicion, the sheriff's department remained publicly committed to its tragic fall theory. The community meetings were filled with strained explanations about unstable rock shelves and deceptive terrain. Officials reminded people that the search area was massive, containing countless cracks deep enough to hide a body but too narrow for search teams to access safely. They emphasized the heat, the predators, the natural dangers, anything to steer attention away from the possibility of foul play. But none of their explanations could account for the missing evidence. No boot scrape where a man climbed down. No broken brush from a man falling. No blood. No scent trail. No discarded hat. No sign of the boots Elias had been wearing. And most importantly, no explanation for why the horse had rope fibers embedded under his mane, an area no rider touched unless restraining an animal by force. Local newspapers began printing pieces that questioned whether the sheriff's department was hiding something. One article suggested there might be political tension involved. After all, the county had been dealing with a spike in illegal alcohol transport, and several deputies had complained privately about under-the-table deals between smugglers and certain landowners. Another column speculated that Elias might have stumbled into a dispute between rival groups and paid the price for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. As pressure from the public increased, the department tried to strengthen its case with whatever forensic methods were available in the 1950s. But the tools were primitive. Dust samples were meaningless in a desert. Footprint molds crumbled before drying. The few fibers collected from Bramble's mane were stored in a small envelope, but without a suspect rope to compare them to, they proved nothing. The environment itself worked against them. Wind erased impressions within hours. Heat warped objects, cracked leather, dried blood too quickly to identify. And animals, coyotes, vultures, even wandering cattle, disturbed subtle evidence long before deputies arrived. Every day that passed made it harder to believe they would ever find answers. The sheriff's office sank deeper into exhaustion. Some deputies worked through meals, through nights, through heat strong enough to blister their arms. They found nothing new, not even discarded items like the pocket knife discovered earlier. The land had gone quiet again. Too quiet. It was the kind of silence that made men uneasy, because it felt intentional, as though whatever had happened to Elias was already buried deeper than they could dig. Spot checks around the gulch revealed no campfire remains, no tire tracks, no fresh animal prints, no signs that another rider had been there. The boot impressions found during the initial search remained the only trace of someone else's presence, and those impressions, after being exposed to wind and heat, had faded into soft, unreadable shapes. The sheriff knew that if foul play had been involved, whoever was responsible had either covered their tracks with expertise or had the advantage of timing. A single night in the desert could erase almost everything. Meanwhile, people who once trusted the sheriff's department began turning their attention inward, whispering theories about their own neighbors. One rancher was known for feuds. Another had a past tied to liquor transport. A local drifter had vanished around the same time, only to reappear weeks later in a different county. A bar owner claimed he'd heard two strangers ask about patrol schedules days before Elias went missing. None of these leads developed into anything solid. They were just fragments, loose threads with no way to tell which connected to the truth. Through it all, Margaret watched the investigation unravel with increasing dread. Every day she asked whether they had found any new sign of her husband. Every day they told her no. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating regularly, stopped leaving the house except to check the yard, the corral, the mailbox, small actions that gave her something to hold on to. Sometimes she stood for long stretches on the ridge behind their property, staring at the horizon, as if the desert might shift and reveal him. In private moments, the sheriff felt the weight of her hope pressing into his chest. He wished he could give her closure. He wished he could believe his own theory. But the pieces refused to fit. The land had taken many men in his lifetime, but never in a way so clean it erased every trace. 2 weeks after the disappearance, he asked Bramble's handler to re-examine the horse. That was when they discovered a second detail, thin abrasions around the horse's jawline, as though the reins had been pulled hard against his skin. That could have been Elias in a moment of panic. But the angle of the marks suggested the horse had been yanked from below, or from someone standing close enough to force his head down. That realization struck the sheriff like a blow. Elias would never allow his reins to be handled that way, and he would never restrain his horse by the mane. Someone else had been there. Someone close enough to touch the animal. Someone who had vanished just as completely as the deputy. And if someone else had been there, then the disappearance was no longer an accident. As this truth settled into the sheriff's mind, a new fear surfaced, because the land wasn't the only thing that erased traces quickly. People did too. And if Elias had indeed crossed paths with someone who wanted him gone, then the next discovery might not be found in the desert at all. It might surface years later, in a place no one expected, and it would force the entire county to face the unsettling possibility that Elias Ward didn't simply vanish. He may have been led into something far bigger than anyone realized. 6 years passed before the desert gave up anything connected to Elias Ward again. 6 years of silence, of rumors settling into local folklore, of Margaret living in a hollow rhythm that never fully adjusted to the absence. People aged. Land changed. The sheriff retired early, claiming health issues but carrying the quiet weight of the one case he couldn't solve. The community adapted in the way small towns do. They didn't forget, but they learned to fold the mystery into daily life, a story whispered at gatherings, a warning told to young ranch hands about riding alone near the Gulch after dark. Then, in the spring of 1962, heavy rains fell across West Texas for nearly a week. The flash flood that followed was the kind that came fast enough to shock even seasoned ranchers. It barreled through low-lying areas, carving new channels and ripping out old ones, dragging debris for miles before thinning into muddy streams. People spent days afterward mending fences, clearing debris, and repairing washed-out roads. No one was thinking about the Ward case when the flood changed everything. A group of county workers clearing the edges of Coyote Gulch found something lodged in a narrow cut between two stones. It was small, so small one of the men nearly stepped over it. But the glint of faded metal caught another worker's eye. He bent down, reached into the crevice, and pulled out a badge so rusted he could barely read the lettering. The back pin had corroded away. The metal was pitted and darkened, but the outline was unmistakable. The embossed 5-point star. The county seal. The etched initials. It was Elias Ward's sheriff's badge. The workers froze. One of them called the sheriff's department. Within an hour, deputies were climbing down the gulch walls again, feeling that same tight unease they'd felt years before. The badge shouldn't have been there. Not in that specific crevice. The cut was far from the ridge where Elias was last seen, and on a narrow ledge the original search had already cleared. The workers insisted the badge hadn't been visible before the flood. The crevice itself appeared newly exposed, freshly carved out by the force of rushing water. When Margaret was told, she didn't speak at first. She simply nodded, as though she'd always expected the land to give something back eventually, even if she didn't know what that something would be. Sheriff Carver, drawn out of retirement, returned to help analyze the site. He stared at the badge for a long time, the muscles in his jaw tensing the way they used to when he was trying to keep emotion off his face. The badge didn't answer any questions. If anything, it raised new ones. How had it ended up in a place that wasn't accessible from the ridge? Why hadn't the initial search found it? And why was it tucked so precisely into a crevice instead of lying in open gravel where a fall might have deposited it? Before they could even process that discovery, 3 hikers stumbled across something even more unsettling. They were walking along a dry stream bed several miles downstream from the gulch when one of them tripped on something hard buried under the silt. He thought it was a piece of metal debris washed down by the flood. But when he wiped away the dirt, he revealed a dark, weathered revolver, the kind issued to deputies in the mid-1950s. The serial number, though partially eroded, was clear enough to identify. It belonged to Elias Ward. The hikers immediately notified the authorities. The revolver's location made no sense at all. The distance between where the badge was found and where the gun surfaced wasn't just far. It was fragmented across rough terrain that the original search parties had covered extensively. There was no record of storm channels strong enough in 1956 to carry objects that distance. If the badge had been washed free by the recent flood, why hadn't the revolver traveled with it? Why had the gun lodged miles away, in a place with no direct water flow from the gulch? Investigators examined the revolver carefully. The barrel was rusted, the cylinder stiff. But the strangest detail wasn't its condition, it was the absence of impact damage. If the weapon had fallen from a height or been violently thrown, dents or warp marks would be visible. Instead, the gun's metal showed uniform wear, like it had been placed gently on the ground and left to the elements. Even the silt pattern embedded in the grip suggested slow coverage over time, not sudden burial from a flood. Theories immediately reignited in the community. Some believed the new discoveries proved Elias had fallen into the gulch during a storm years earlier, and recent flooding had finally uncovered his belongings. But that explanation faltered under scrutiny. There had been no storm the night he vanished. The land had been bone dry, the sky clear. If he'd been dragged through a drainage channel, the disturbance would have been visible in the soft earth when the original search occurred. Others insisted the badge and revolver had been intentionally scattered, placed to mislead or to create the impression of a natural accident long after the fact. Some wondered if the items had been carried at different times by different forces, water, animals, or even humans, before finally reappearing. But none of those theories explained why the objects had been separated by so many miles, nor why they surfaced only after nature forced the terrain to shift again. The sheriff attempted to reconstruct the possible path Elias or someone moving his belongings might have taken. He traced the gulch's channels, marked the flood lines, consulted with hydrologists. The experts agreed that the badge could have been carried by floodwaters from an upper section of the gulch down into the newly exposed crevice. But the revolver? No river channel touched the area where it was found. It was on high ground, protected from the strong currents of the seasonal floods. As the town wrestled with these contradictions, an elderly ranch hand stepped forward with something he'd been withholding for years. He was in his late 70s now, his memory slow, but his conscience sharp. He told the sheriff that on the night Elias vanished, he'd been out fixing a broken fence near his property. Sometime after dark, he heard a single gunshot echo across the plains. He thought it was someone hunting coyotes, or maybe a rancher scaring off a mountain lion. It wasn't unusual to hear gunfire at night, and he hadn't connected it to Elias until the next morning, when word of the disappearance spread. But by then, fear of being blamed or dragged into something dangerous had kept him quiet. The sheriff listened without judgment. The timing lined up too well to ignore. A gunshot, a missing revolver, and a deputy who left no trace behind. But the location where the ranch hand had heard the sound wasn't near the gulch. It was closer to the ridge, miles from where the items would later be found. And if the shot had come from Elias's weapon, why wasn't there a body? If he'd fired at someone, who had he fired at? And if someone had fired at him, why was the gun later found with no obvious signs of struggle? Every new detail stretched the timeline thinner. The badge's location suggested Elias had been near the upper Gulch at some point. The revolver's location suggested he, or someone carrying his weapon, had traveled miles across unstable desert. The gunshot suggested a confrontation. But none of these pieces overlapped in a way that produced a coherent story. And that was what disturbed investigators most. The clues didn't just fail to support a single theory, they actively contradicted one another. As though someone had taken the key moments of Elias's final hours and separated them across the land, scattering them so that no one could ever recreate the sequence accurately. People who had once leaned toward the idea of an accident began reconsidering. Those who believed in foul play doubled down. And a small group, the ones who had spent the most time in the Gulch during the original search, felt something deeper, something they had struggled to articulate since 1956. The items didn't feel lost. They felt placed far enough apart that no one could be certain what had actually happened. Placed in locations that mimicked natural accident patterns but fell apart under scrutiny. Placed in a way that made the disappearance look unsolvable by design. The badge and the revolver were not the clues that solved the mystery. They were the clues that reopened it and made it stranger than ever. And just when the case reached the point where no theory held steady, another discovery in the early 1970s would push the mystery into its darkest stage yet, forcing investigators to confront the possibility that Elias's disappearance had never been about the land at all. By the early 1970s, the case that had once consumed an entire county had become little more than a haunting memory for most people. Time had carried families into new decades, children had grown, and the land itself had shifted under storms and droughts. But for those who'd lived through the summer of 1956, Elias Ward's disappearance lingered like a bruise beneath the skin, never fading enough to forget, never healing enough to accept. When the sheriff's badge and revolver surfaced in the early 60s, the story briefly sparked again, but without answers, the flame had died back down. It wasn't until forensic teams from the state university requested to review the case with their newer technology that the county found itself dragged back into the mystery it had never been able to bury. 3 forensic specialists arrived in town in the fall of 1972, armed with tools and knowledge that didn't exist 16 years earlier. They brought new methods for examining metal wear, soil patterns, and weathering rates. They asked to see everything: photographs, reports, witness notes, the pocket knife, the badge, the revolver, the fibers collected from Bramble's Maine decades earlier. Margaret, older now, quieter, still living alone in the ranch house Elias never came home to, allowed them access to the personal items she had kept locked away in a cedar box. She didn't trust that this new effort would solve anything. But she also couldn't let herself refuse. The case had shaped too much of her life to turn away now. The first conclusion the forensic team reached was simple but significant. None of the items recovered showed the kind of damage consistent with being dropped from height, something the sheriff's department had assumed in the early days. The badge, though rusted and pitted, carried no dents or impact marks. The revolver, despite decades of exposure, showed only environmental corrosion. No crushed metal, no cracked cylinder, no warped frame. If either object had been carried downward by a fall, if either had been thrown, or if either had tumbled across rock during a slide, they should have shown damage. Instead, the wear pattern suggested they had been placed somewhere stable and exposed slowly to weather over time. This alone weakened the long-standing official explanation of an accidental fall. But the forensic team didn't stop there. They studied soil found inside the badge's crevices and compared it to samples from multiple layers of the Gulch. The composition suggested the badge had not originally been lodged where it was found, meaning the flood might have exposed it, but likely hadn't transported it. The revolver, on the other hand, contained silt inconsistent with the stream bed where it was discovered. That suggested it too had been moved at some point, possibly long after Elias vanished. Whatever had happened that night, the placement of these objects wasn't natural. It wasn't clean. It wasn't consistent. The team interviewed surviving deputies who had conducted the original search. Some were now in their 60s, eyes clouded with memory, still trying to reconcile what they'd seen and what they couldn't explain. A few finally spoke openly about how the Gulch had felt wrong, how wind moved against itself, how echoes seemed to come from directions without bodies, how the land felt disturbed though undamaged. They admitted they'd never believed Elias simply fell. They'd always suspected someone else had been present, someone who had managed to erase their presence with unnerving precision. The forensic team reviewed these accounts carefully, but avoided leaning into superstition. Their focus remained on evidence. They examined the rope fibers found beneath Bramble's mane, comparing them to known rope types from the 1950s. The pattern matched a coarse, inexpensive rope used primarily for makeshift restraints, not something carried by deputies, and not something typically used to tie a horse. They concluded the fibers likely resulted from someone restraining the horse briefly, badly, and in a moment of urgency. It suggested a confrontation, not a lone accident where a horse spooked and bolted on its own. Something had startled the animal violently enough to force its head down and leave abrasions along its jaw, something Elias himself would not have caused unless he'd been in severe distress. This finding reframed the horse's involvement entirely. Bramble had not run from a fall. He had fled from something sudden, perhaps a struggle, a threat, or a sound sharp enough to trigger primal fear. The forensic team then revisited the strange boot prints discovered near the Gulch in 1956. Though the prints themselves were long gone, early photographs taken by deputies provided some shape outlines. They weren't definitive, but they showed the boots were an uncommon size and style for the region. They did not match any known deputy, volunteer, or rancher. They belonged to someone who had been there that night, someone the investigation never identified. Piece by piece, the 1970s team dismantled the original narrative. There was no fall. There was no sign of suicide. No natural event had carried Elias off the trail. No animal attack could account for the missing body, intact equipment, and contradictory clues. And most importantly, no part of the evidence suggested Elias moved deeper into Coyote Gulch on his own. If anything, every sign pointed to interference, someone guiding him, forcing him, or stopping him before the gulch swallowed everything else. But even with these revelations, one fact remained immovable. No human remains were ever found. Not then. Not 6 years after. Not 16 years after. Not even decades later, when another flood stripped whole sections of the gulch bare. The land kept whatever it had taken. The desert wind erased tracks within hours, and time buried the rest. Whatever happened to Elias, it happened so quickly and cleanly that even with new methods and modern tools, investigators couldn't reconstruct the moment. The desert had swallowed the truth with the same quiet finality it had swallowed the deputy. Margaret listened to the forensic team's findings with the same steady composure she had carried since 1956. She absorbed the contradictions, the impossibilities, the hints of human involvement. She said little, but those who were there remembered a moment where her face softened, not with relief, but with something like confirmation, like she had always assumed someone else had been near her husband that night, even if she never said it aloud. The team filed their final report with the county. Evidence does not support accidental death. Evidence does not support suicide. Evidence suggests external interference. Case remains unresolved. For the community, the report reopened the wound. Some adopted the belief that Elias had interrupted illicit activity and paid the price. Others speculated he had been ambushed and taken somewhere far from the gulch. A few believed he'd been forced along a path invisible to searchers, hidden by the terrain itself. But no theory stood without contradiction. Every possible explanation broke against the same barrier. Nothing physical on that land explained how a grown man, experienced with the terrain, vanished without leaving a single footprint or trace of struggle. And so the story settled into a kind of uneasy truth, the kind that lay between logic and speculation. A deputy had disappeared on a clear night in 1956. His horse returned alone, trembling, with rope fibers tangled beneath its mane. His badge and revolver surfaced miles apart years later, in places that defied natural placement. Tracks belonging to an unknown person appeared briefly and then vanished. No body was ever found. No suspect ever emerged. No confession, no witness, no undeniable clue. Only the empty saddle remained, the one image no one in the county ever forgot. The saddle that represented a man who should have come home but didn't. The saddle that symbolized a trail that ended not in tragedy they understood, but in a silence no one could penetrate. The desert had returned pieces of the story, scattered and warped by time. But it had never given back the truth. And people who lived near the gulch, especially those who'd spent a lifetime listening to its strange winds and watching its shadows stretch at dusk, carried a quiet belief that something deliberate had happened out there. Something done by human hands, hands that knew the land well and knew how to make it complicit. Something buried so deep beneath the shifting earth and memories that it would never rise again. In the end, Elias Ward's disappearance remained exactly what it felt like from the first moment his horse came home alone. A cold case the land refused to surrender, a story without a final chapter, a reminder that even the most open landscapes can hide secrets too well for anyone to uncover.